Hello, and welcome to another episode of Muview with Mo. This time we have something a little bit different. We have our first international researcher, a person doing their research outside of the United States. I'd like to introduce my friend, Dana Korneisel. She got her master's here at Virginia Tech. She was co-advised by Shuhai Zhao and Sterling Nesbitt, and now she has her master's and is doing her PhD work up in Canada. Dana, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. You did a great little introduction. I did my master's at Virginia Tech with Morrison and many of the other people you've had on your show, where I was studying taphonomy. I moved a year ago now up to Ottawa, Ontario, where I'm associated with Carleton University, and I'm researching the origin of the neck in vertebrates.
Nice.
So a little pivot, but still vertebrate paleontology.
Yeah, and just to clarify for our audience, taphonomy is the study of basically everything that happens to some organism between the time that it dies and the time that the fossil is put up onto the shelf after all the analysis is done.
Yes, that is absolutely correct.
And it's pretty neat that you're studying the origin of the neck. That's something that we don't think a lot about, but it's a very important evolutionary transition in the change from water-based living to land-based living.
Absolutely. It's very important for all of the things that we do think about as more important for terrestriality, for living on land, and that without a neck to separate your skull from your shoulder blades, you can't really develop very powerful forelimbs to travel around outside of the water. And it also frees up some space for the development of your hearing apparatus to make sure that you can actually hear things in an air environment.
So one thing that I like talking about with my interviewees is learning a little bit more about their backgrounds and the life paths that people have taken on their way to their current time. And Dana, would you like to talk a little bit about where all you're from and what all you've done up to now?
Sure. I am from Michigan, so you introduced me as an international researcher, but I am in fact American, just happen to be living an hour or so outside of the U.S. I grew up in Western Michigan.
90% of Canada, though, of Canadians, though.
This is absolutely true. We're very close to the border, almost all of us. But I grew up in Holland, Michigan, famous for its Tulip Time Festival, being one of the few not Dutch people there, and thought that I would be in Michigan for pretty much my whole childhood and young adulthood. Planned on being a University of Michigan researcher at some point because I decided to go into paleontology when I was in preschool, and had a good plan in mind. Then the 2008 recession hit, and my family moved out to Iowa following the closing of the factory my dad worked in. And we found ourselves in a very different but still Midwestern state where I did my high school career, my undergraduate university studies at Iowa State University, and lived for a little while in the gap after my undergraduate years before I moved out to Virginia. And I'd say that's my upbringing.
Nice. It's, I always like to joke that people from Iowa, I like to say that they're Iowanians in much the same way that I say that people from Maine are the mayonnaise.
I know you do. I know you like to say that. They are in fact Iowans, and Michiganders are Michiganders.
Does that imply the existence of Michigese?
I think that it might. So I think if we're being as technical as possible, I am in fact a Michigoose.
One other interesting thing that you've been up to that our audience might be interested in learning more about is that you spent some time with the Peace Corps.
Yes. Like I said a moment ago, I took a break between my undergraduate degree and my master's, where my plan was to take 3 years for a 2.5-year Peace Corps service and a period of readjustment. I served in Tanzania. So I was a biology teacher for essentially high school age students at an all-girls school in southern Tanzania, Ndwika Girls School. A little shout out for them. That was follow-up from my undergraduate degrees, where I got degrees in both biology and geology, which made me qualified to teach high school bio. I did that only for about a year before being evacuated from my site for local reasons, not major national reasons or any health crisis or anything like that. But for local reasons, I was evacuated from my site and returned home pretty early. I spent a year working in the nonprofit sector, sourcing food for Iowa Food Bank before returning to research after about a 2-year break in the end.
Nice. So how was your experience teaching biology to high schoolers? How did you enjoy that?
It was pretty great. I was lucky to be placed at an all-girls school. And I say that was lucky for me because as a Western teacher coming in from a different cultural background, my students perceived me very differently than they did the other adults in their life, which put me in a really helpful position to offer them like reproductive health information and have some of the tough conversations for like 13 to 18-year-old girls that they weren't able to have with their parents or their other teachers from a combination of cultural stigma. And of course, they were at a boarding school, so they didn't have their parents around or older siblings around to talk to. So it gave me a really great opportunity, especially since I was teaching reproduction in biology, to open up a space to give my students information about their health and help them in their life.
Nice. It's always good to hear about the ways that you feel that you've been able to help and access other people.
Absolutely.
I'm just kind of curious, in terms of general biology concepts, were there any particular lesson topics that were especially difficult to teach the students, like some that took additional effort to explain?
Yeah, so I was, I guess I should say I was teaching in English. English is the medium of instruction for high school in Tanzania. However, in middle and elementary school, I'm using U.S. terminology, but in what would be middle and elementary school in the U.S., instruction is in Swahili. So the students are thrown into an English medium school after only having a couple hours a week in English instruction for most of their lives. So all of the lessons were a bit challenging because I slowed down and took a lot of time to make sure that the terminology that I would usually use was understood and was terminology that they had learned up until that point, especially when I was teaching first-year high schoolers. One topic that I found challenging in a different way, besides the language barrier and the reliance that I had on my students for helping me figure out Swahili words that I didn't know, was genetics. We were doing like classic Mendelian genetics, which point I realized that when I learned genetics in school, we used a lot of simple like human examples to be related to that almost all had to do with eye color and hair color, which is a ridiculous concept, a ridiculous set of examples to use in a Tanzanian classroom. So I started talking in my lecture one day and then went, all this nonsense, right? All this nonsense about blonde and red hair means nothing. It led to me bringing in pictures of other volunteers and my siblings, because some of my students didn't believe that I could have blonde siblings since I have brown hair, and didn't believe that red hair was real outside of cartoons. So that was one that was an interesting challenge. I had a very sweet student who I love dearly, and I was teaching my class, and I said red hair, because I admitted to them, I was like, okay, I'll think of a better example for our next class. I have kind of a silly one for now, but I brought up red hair as a potential hair color. And a very nice student who is just super sweet and was my biggest helper in coming up with Swahili words, because her English was phenomenal, raised her hand and very gently said, "Madam, people don't have red hair. That's only in cartoons." She was cluing me in on something that was very embarrassing that I didn't realize, but yeah.
This may be a strange question, but I remember like one of the other commonly used examples for genetic inheritance is like earlobe fusion or separateness. And honestly, I don't remember
Yeah.
how prevalent that was like used as an example or as a demonstration in my high school biology examples, but was that useful?
I think what I ended up using was thumbs,
Oh, okay.
whether your thumb goes to a 180-degree angle or extends beyond it.
Okay.
We used thumbs, and then I don't remember what else we did, but we brainstormed in one of my classes and used some more culturally relevant information.
Yeah. Did you use that like the tongue thing where like certain people are genetically able to fold their tongue along 3 axes rather than just the one major axis?
I think we considered it, but I cannot do the 3. So trying to explain it was troublesome. And then when I did the rolling your tongue into one tube, my students were also just like, "What is she doing? Like, what?" Maybe as like littler kids they messed around, but they did not see adults doing such ridiculous things regularly.
Wagging their tongue, so to speak.
Yes.
Thanks for sharing some of those experiences with us today.
Oh, no problem.
I want to talk a little bit more about your research, since I think our audience would be very interested in learning about the research that you did in your master's program at Virginia Tech.
Of course. So my project at Virginia Tech was a re-examining of some bone material from Babesiosaurus inexpectus, which is a northeast Chinese dinosaur. It's from the like very famous area of feathered Chinese dinosaurs. You've probably heard of and seen pictures of many of these just gorgeous fossils from northeast China that have feathers preserved and are well articulated, just amazing specimens. The Babesiosaurus is a therizinosaur, so the kind of type of dinosaur that has like the big beer belly and giant claws on its hands you might have seen, but it's from the early Cretaceous, so it doesn't look quite as crazy as Therizinosaurus itself. And at the time of its discovery back in the 90s, it was the largest theropod with feathers. And I think the largest dinosaur with any feathers that had been collected, associated to that time. So the researchers in the 90s who had described and then done some histology on this specimen, where they cut thin sections of the bone to look at the microstructures within the bone itself, had found little kind of red-orange colored spheres, and they were all in the channels in the bone that blood vessels go through when the animal's alive. And based on the placement, the color, and roughly the size of these spheres, they proposed that these might in fact be fossilized blood cells. So my research for my master's was then applying chemical analyses using standard lasers and ion beams to look at the composition of different parts of the bone, trying to approach the composition of the spheres themselves to assess that claim that perhaps blood cells were fossilized. And my results was that they in fact appeared to be made of clays, of kaolinite-like clays that probably formed in the vessel space of the bone during diagenesis, that process of time, the time period covered by taphonomy after the animal died to the point that it was collected. And these clays are accompanied by a lot of different shapes and colors of gunk filling in the vessels besides just the spheres. And there are a lot, and then there are a lot of different clues when you look chemically that the bone was very highly altered in ways that aren't consistent with microstructure preservation of cells, especially cells that are floating in a fluid while they're being used, like blood cells are.
It was a very neat project where you got to work with some very spectacular materials. And I will say that I'm very fortunate in that I kind of got to piggyback on a little bit of some of what you were doing, that we happened to go to China at the same time. I for my research on the Do-Shantou Formation, and you for your research on Beipiaosaurus. And because we were overlapping a little bit on our time, I got to kind of follow Dana around a little bit and see both of the two major specimens that she was working with of Beipiaosaurus at two different Chinese institutions.
And we got to visit, 3 different really awesome museums together on
really
the trip?
Excellent ones. Would you like to tell our audience a little bit about some of these museums?
For sure. So on our trip to China 2 years ago, yes, China in the summer, my God, it was extremely hot.
Yes, our vertebrate friends are much smarter than us. They go to places in the summer that are hot and dry, whereas we work ourselves in places that are hot and wet.
It wasn't much of a choice since the paper was already written on the material, and the material was chosen for my project. But in hindsight, should have gone in the winter or something, because woof, Beijing in the summer. But we visited the IVPP Museum, the Institute of Vertebrate Paleontology and Paleoanthropology, which is, I think, the largest collection of vertebrate paleontology researchers at one institution in the whole world, is in Beijing. And their museum, it was the first place we went. We were mostly there for fun, but the main specimen that I used in my research is also housed in the collections of that museum, and it's where we met up with a couple of excellent researchers, including Junqi Liao, who is PhD candidate now associated with IVPP and was looking at the growth of Beipiaosaurus throughout its life. So we met up with those researchers and we got to go to the IVPP Museum, which, in addition to having some really cool giant mounts and just a wide array of fossils from throughout China, also had an at the time broken but robot acanthostega, I think is what it was, that if we were there at a more opportune time, you could push a button and the robot would move the cast of acanthostega in its projected motions. We missed out on getting to see that work, but it was pretty darn cool.
Clearly, they were working on incorporating the very important Billy Bass singing technology into such a thing.
Absolutely. I only wish that the music was working, if not the mechanics. I don't know if you have anything that you want to add about the IVPP Museum.
I think that just about covers it, but yeah, it's a spectacular collection, and I'm glad that we got to go and visit it. I remember that as we were, well, I should say as you were taking a look at the specimen, I was kind of along for the ride and to provide a little help as we were setting up in one of the collections rooms to take the photographs of the material, that we were having to step beside half-open jackets of 3-foot-tall sauropod vertebrae. And make some amongst all of that, which was pretty nice.
We had to do a lot of that at the what was the Shandong Provincial Museum, I think, as well, where we saw an additional Therizinosaur that wasn't a Beipiaosaurus, but was an additional Therizinosaurus specimen that we got to take a look at. And it was there was a sauropod sacrum that was the size of a queen-size mattress, across and much deeper. And I think at one point, our advisor, Shuhai, you and 2 of the researchers we were visiting were stabilizing a ladder that I had to climb up on to get a picture of the specimen to get the whole thing in one shot. But that was an excellent museum as well. I think it was the Shandong Provincial Museum, where they had a vast number of specimens, as well as that were focused on the province, in addition to some mineralogical and mining and industry-based information for the province. The last museum we went to as part of that trip was the Tianyu Museum, which is in Pinyi, I think also in the Shandong province, and it is huge.
If I remember correctly, it's one of, if not the largest collection of vertebrate fossil material in the world.
It's gotta be. It's unbelievably massive. I think, 6 floors and 2 separate buildings of exhibit halls.
Huge blocks of buildings.
Just huge. They had the Hall of 1,000 Deer that had hundreds of Miocene deer specimens and rhinos and just things from all over China that at one point were part of a private collection that has been turned into a museum, so that the specimens can be researched. That was also where the other specimen of Babecaosaurus that wasn't the main focus of the project, but it is the second specimen, was located.
And if I remember correctly, that was the one that was dubbed the bearded one, correct?
Yes, absolutely. It was the reason I learned one of my 5 Mandarin words while I was there, that I could say, I think, chufu for beard, which I mispronounced so badly that any actual speaker can't understand me, but was still, it got across eventually. It was at least a parlor trick, if not a useful piece of communication.
Just to talk about the Tianyu Museum a little bit more, Dana mentioned the Hall of 1,000 Deer, and they had additional fossils of deer outside of that hall in great quantities. They have a similar Hall of 1,000 Serpents, which was fossils of ichthyosaurs, mesosaurs, and other Mesozoic marine reptiles of all sorts of kinds, just dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of slabs all along the walls and in central tables. They must have had, upwards of 100 Psittacosaurus specimens and eggs. They had other Mesozoic aged bird fossils. If I remember correctly, they had some great examples both of male and female Confusornis.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, just a phenomenal amount of fossil wonder and things to look through. I remember, unfortunately, we didn't have a lot of time to look through the public displays, but it was very fun to take a look at. I remember
I got sick the second day.
Oh.
I had to miss a few of the halls. I was just getting, I think, a little bit of heat stroke or something. But what we did see was just massive.
And it was that humid. Yeah, you lost a lot of water, and you'd have to be constantly drinking.
Yeah, and the one thing that was really unique about the Tianyu Museum too, besides just the scope of it, was the display of the specimens. Those flat slabs, either with ichthyosaurs or crinoids on them, would be preserved in these carved wooden frames and look hung like artwork. And then they'd have turtle shells that they would sculpt a wooden turtle in and place it for display, and just lots of stuff like that, really artistic displays of some of these fossils.
That's one of those things, if I ever get the kind of money that coal magnate who founded that museum had, that, I'd get myself a nice little artistic diptych of 2 of those big panels of those floating crinoid specimens set up as in the style of 2 scrolls or screens, the way that they
God, absolutely.
They just look so pretty.
They're beautiful and just unbelievable, just beautiful, 2 meters long with loads of calyxes and branches. The void in the center where the log they were anchored to was
sometimes
just amazing.
Ammonite framing it where it's, some sort of artistic composition almost, or in really spectacular.
Yeah.
You get both the crinoid and an ichthyosaur or something.
Yeah.
They're almost monochrome. There's not a lot of color variance in those slabs, and it really kind of adds to the, I'm a little bit hesitant to use the word artistry of the specimens, but they are very artistic and very aesthetically pleasing in a lot of ways.
They absolutely are. And there were a few examples where I think you could say artistry, where a paddle would be reconstructed onto an ichthyosaur that was missing one.
Yeah.
So they'd have a cute little polka dot paddle that you could tell wasn't the original bone or something like that.
Which that is just kind of an aside, but Mesozoic marine reptiles do have very distinctive and very unusual hand anatomy. If you ever want to pull up a picture for reference, the ichthyosaurs,
absolutely,
the mosasaurs, and the plesiosaurs all have very unique and interesting hand anatomy. Like mosasaurs, they just straight up are lizard hands encased in lots of flesh, whereas the ichthyosaurs just decide, let's have lots and lots of little stubby rocks in our hand.
And you have to have Kirsten on to give you more information on that.
Yeah. Kirsten Formoso is a paleontologist who's done some work. I believe she worked with Sterling and Michelle.
Yes.
Yeah. Maybe we'll be able to get her on the show sometime.
Yeah, she's now a marine reptile researcher in California.
Nice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's since we're on the topic of museums in China, so Dana and I were there with our advisor Shuhai, and also for some of that time we were with another master's student of Shuhai's, Max Schwid, who defended his master's earlier this summer. And the three of us got to do some interesting things together, like walking a portion of the Great Wall of China, which was a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Max and I also got to visit a couple of other museums while we were in China that I thought I would talk about a little bit. One was the Museum of the Imperial Exam System. There is a museum dedicated to the exam system that Chinese bureaucrat aspirants would take and be involved with over a period of like many centuries. It was a very interesting museum, showing like some of the places where all of these students would come around to have to take the test, and talking about like different styles of scholar dress over time, and the history of the exam as it was used over the course of a couple of different dynasties. It was very interesting, and parts of it were very architecturally interesting. Like, to get into the museum, you kind of walk down a pathway around the perimeter of a big kind of architectural block, and then like the base of the block is a semi-open space that's kind of part of the museum that has some of the exhibits, and then you move into different parts indoors, and that was an interesting setup.
Yeah.
And then Max and I also went to an institution called NIGPUS, Nanjing Institute of Geoscience and Paleontology. It is a geoscience institute and university in Nanjing that also has an attached natural science museum that Max and I got to go and visit with some of our fellow researchers, like the visiting researcher, Dr. Ki Peng, who spent some time in the US with us. But he works at the Nanjing University, and so we got to meet up with him there, which was nice, and to see some of the museum, which is a very nice kind of introductory natural history museum. At the time, they were putting together a very nice exhibit on the Cambrian explosion fauna, like highlighting the Qianjiang Lagerstätten's Cambrian materials. And this particular exhibit was not all the way prepared and was not yet open to the public, but while we were touring the museum, Max Shuhai and I got to see a little bit of the behind the scenes of as they were putting it together, and that was pretty neat.
Yeah, that's really cool. I know after you all left, or at least after we split up on that trip, I went out to the field locality that Beipyaosaurus is from, and there is a museum there that in the future I very much want to visit, but I walked through the like bones of its construction site because they have plopped this massive structure right down on top of one of the locality that Beipyaosaurus was collected at.
Oh, nice.
And it's now this huge shell of a building. I'm sure it's progressed in the last 2 years since we were there. And they've set it up so that the basement exhibit room, the walls are the section.
Oh, nice.
The actual rock in situ, and they have prepped and encased specimens in situ, leaving them in the ground and putting the ground level about a meter below the fossil layer so that you can walk through and see unmoved specimens of birds and psittacosaurs and other things that have just glass has been placed over them, but other than that, they were prepped in place and put into what's going to be the basement exhibit hall of this huge museum that's in the Liaoning Fossil Bird Preserve, I believe.
That's pretty neat. It reminds me of Dinosaurs National Monument. In one of their historical quarries, they have a similar building where it's essentially a huge structure just around this one quarry, preserving a number of mostly sauropod and I believe possibly some hadrosaur remains. But it's really spectacular when you can architecturally do something like that, where you encase and preserve one of these beds for the public to see.
Yeah, I remember visiting Dinosaur National Monument as a kid when I was maybe 9 or 10 years old, and just seeing the active excavation inside the structure was unbelievable. It was like the coolest thing I've ever seen.
Yeah. You know what I like about Dinosaur National Monument?
What?
Most of the stuff that they're getting from out of there is from the Morrison Formation.
Ideal. You should lay a claim.
I should roll up to Morrison, Colorado and claim everything named after that city is mine.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you mentioned that as a museum that you'd like to go and visit. Are there any other museums that you hope to visit someday?
Oh man, absolutely. I have always wanted to go to the Natural History Museum in Berlin.
Ooh, yeah, pretty spectacular.
I've always wanted to go there and would absolutely love to at some point. I'm also interested recently for perhaps some of this research related to the evolution of the neck in visiting I'm going to get the name wrong, but the Natural History Museum that houses the fossil collections in Copenhagen. There are some specimens there that I would really like to see. So a little trip to Denmark and Germany would be just a dream when all of this COVID business is behind us, hopefully.
Yeah. Yeah. For the museum in Berlin, if I remember correctly, don't they have several of the Archaeopteryx specimens? Because I know that there's at least one at the British Museum, and I know that there's one in Thermopolis here in the US. And because Archaeopteryx is from Germany, I assume that the remaining are still in Germany, and I would presume at the Berlin Museum.
I believe that's true. I know the holotype is housed there. I believe all of the specimens. I thought it was all the specimens that weren't the one at the British Museum, but I've actually been to Thermopolis, so I should have remembered that one as well. I think the rest of them are in Berlin. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be pretty neat to see, and to actually like go to the Solhofen. I don't know where the Solhofen is in relationship to Berlin, but if you can combine that into your trip to Germany, that would be a lot of fun.
Yeah, and I know I've got my research lab here at Carleton University is evolution and development, developmentary biology, in addition to paleontology, using the development of embryos of modern animals to inform paleontological research. So there is a lot of communication between our lab here and a developmental biology and paleontology research group at the Natural History Museum in Berlin. So maybe that opportunity will come to me in the near future, since we're exchanging postdocs in this next year. So we might as well have a lot of research collaboration stay in place for that.
Yeah, it sounds like you have an opportunity to weasel your way in.
Absolutely.
You know what I would like to do in Germany?
What?
I'd like to go down to the Black Forest and get myself like an authentic German nutcracker.
Or a clock?
I'd be more interested in the nutcracker than the clock, but a cuckoo clock, like an actual German cuckoo clock, would also be pretty cool. Although I suspect that it might travel a little bit more poorly back through the plane.
Possibly, yeah. I'd say my main interest, besides the fossils in Germany, would have to be the pretzels and spaghetti ice cream.
Spaghetti ice cream?
I have been told by Germans recently that it is for kids, but do not listen to them. Adults can eat it. They deep freeze vanilla ice cream and press it through a pasta press. So it looks like spaghetti. And then you can top it with strawberry sauce and shredded white chocolate, and it'll look like a plate of spaghetti until you dip your spoon in.
That sounds very clever.
Oh, and it's delicious.
Yeah, I'm waiting for that to make its way over here to the U.S., like how ice cream rolls have become a thing here recently. I wonder how long it'll take for spaghetti ice cream to get established in the foodways of the U.S.
I know it was big in Germany in the 80s, so hopefully not too much longer.
We can only hope.
Can only dream.
Well, one other thing that I like talking with my guests about is the presentation of our science and of science in general in the media. And I was wondering if there are any particular pieces of media, be they books or movies or other things, that you feel have done either a particularly good or a particularly bad job presenting your science.
Yeah, so since I'm doing Evo Devo now, I have to recommend Your Inner Fish.
Of course.
I think it was Nova, but it might have just been a PBS general documentary about based around a popular science book written by a researcher at University of Chicago. They put together this documentary version of the book that explores the relics in our anatomy of our aquatic heritage, our old marine heritage back in our fish ancestors. And when I watched it the first time, I was like, this is science communication. I loved it. I thought it, and I think it holds up. It's so well done, and it explores that side of paleontology where you have like a wet lab where you're working with modern specimens in a unique way that I haven't seen in a lot of other media, in addition to connecting it to us as humans, to our species and our bodies and things that we can observe about ourselves.
Yeah. Spoilers, it's that genetic history of ours that leads to us having things like the ability to get hernias.
There are some very unfortunate side effects, but it's cool even if it leads to us choking or whatever else.
Yeah, or leads to like a particular vein that goes like half the way down into our body cavity just to get back up to our throat.
Yeah, you can blame me in my research area for that one, messing up where the head ends and the body begins.
Yeah, so back in 2006, 2007, when Neil Shubin was putting out his work on Tiktaalik, the important transitional fish to tetrapod find that is part of your work on the origin of the neck, I was in 6th and 7th grade at the time, and I was like following the press releases, and I picked up a copy of Your Inner Fish, and I really enjoyed that book. And Neil Shubin was kind of a hero of mine for that reason. And I was very excited that when I was interviewing at different colleges, I visited University of Chicago and got a chance to listen to him give a lecture kind of on that topic, and got a chance to get him to sign my copy of Your Inner Fish. And so that was something really cool for undergrad freshman Morrison.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, he's very friendly, talking about on the topic of like science communication. He's a very friendly guy. So that's a big positive as well. Tiktaalik is housed at the Canadian Museum of Nature right now in Ottawa.
Oh, nice.
So it's in Ottawa. It's very close to Ottawa. So it's right across the river from me here, that specimen is, even though, of course, it will ultimately be housed in a future museum up in Nunavut.
Oh, that's
because here in Canada, fossil specimens belong to the province in which they're discovered, and in this case, the territory, and they must ultimately reside in that territory so that the fossil resources of the entire country, especially the First Nations within Canada, are not all centralized and taken away to be down here in the south.
And just kind of on that note, if I recall correctly, the genus name Tiktaalik actually is derived from an Inuit word, if I remember correctly, referring to a kind of fish that lives in stony rivers.
I believe you're right about that. I don't know the details, but I think that's correct.
Yeah, I'd have to look it up. But one thing that I found very formative and kind of frightening when I was reading Your Inner Fish is a perspective that Neil Shubin presents that kind of scares me a little bit. He talks about how one thing that he's very thankful for is that his background and knowledge as a vertebrate paleontologist very much prepares him to teach undergrads about human anatomy, and that makes him very valuable for med students, and that's a value that he can provide to the university. What scares me about that is listening to the guy who basically discovered the missing link between fish and land animals is concerned about job security is a little bit scary.
Well, we all are, aren't we?
Yeah.
But medical schools are a great place that paleontologists can get their income to continue doing paleontological work, since we are mostly, especially vertebrate paleontologists, essentially just anatomy experts who like old things.
You can learn a lot from anatomy.
Absolutely. I think I'll add on the name of Tiktaalik, I believe the language that the word derives from is Inuktitut.
The species name of Tiktaalik rosier is derived, if I recall correctly, from the name of an otherwise anonymous donor that helped pay for the expedition to the far north to find this material.
I thought it was just because it's kind of pink colored. Maybe I'm completely wrong.
Kind of speaking about media, I know that you are a big reader of many books and that you keep a very neat little journal of the books that you read. Would you like to talk about that journal and some of the stuff that you've found particularly edifying?
Oh, sure. My little book journal is my most beloved piece of jewelry by strangers and an excellent icebreaker. I actually have two tiny little books that have tiny little pages and are bound with leather that are pendants that I wear around pretty frequently. The first of which I started during my Peace Corps service to write down the books that I was reading while I was there, because before I started keeping it, I've read a very large number of books just across my growing years of life. And I found so many times that I'd pick something up and go, have I read this? And get like 100 pages in and go like, I think I read this when I was in 6th grade or something like that. So, and especially while I was in Tanzania, I was making an effort to read more about the history of humanitarianism and East African history, post-colonialism, pre-colonialism, and expanding that area of my knowledge. So I started assigning a page after I finish a book. I draw it a little picture in colored pencils and write down the name of the book on a page. And I filled one and rolled over into another that does not have nearly as many volumes in it as I would like, since I do an awful lot of reading as part of my research and find that I have a little less time just for fun. But the books I'm reading now, I just finished Children of Blood and Bone, which is just a fantastic fantasy book. There's a sequel out that I haven't had the chance to get my hands on yet, but it's an excellent fantasy novel with a really unique system of magic. So check that out. Now I'm reading Bearing the Cross, a very dense biography of Martin Luther King Jr., but a very thorough biography as well, and his relation to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference during Civil Rights era in the U.S., Civil Rights era round 1, maybe. And then also started reading, I think it's called Red Wolf, Black Leopard, something like that, which is also a fantasy novel and is really graphic. So pick that one up if you'd like, but it is very graphic and it does not take a long time to get into it. So those three are what I've been reading lately, but hopefully the two that I'm actively on will be making their way into my little book, and I can find more stuff to take in soon. I've had my eye on two books, Inferior and Superior, that are about the history of science trying to define differences in genders and the history of race science, respectively.
Nice. This will be a little bit of a stretch, but are there any fiction books that you've read that you feel engaged very well with science or with geoscience and paleontology specifically? There's one example that I'm thinking of, but I'm wondering if there's any that you've encountered that you are interested in.
Can it be one that I just loved a lot, but isn't very scientifically valuable?
Yeah, go ahead.
I read the Dinotopia books as a kid, and I thought they were awesome. So, plug for Dinotopia books, where I learned the definition of the word awe and oasis.
One book that I read that I think you'd probably enjoy, it's called Anathem by Neil Stephenson. And It's a very good book, but it's unfortunately a very difficult book to describe any of the plot of without giving huge spoilers.
Okay.
Other than to say that it's kind of a sci-fi speculative fiction alternate history. And it has a really great scene where the main characters are essentially traveling by raft in this world's equivalent to something like the Grand Canyon. And the tour guide that they're traveling with is a kind of very salt of the earth type person. And he talks about how he came to understand just the enormity of deep time, in that he could see in the cliff walls of the canyon that they are traveling through, that the rocks at the top are very different from the rocks at the bottom, and that there are some huge boulders in the river that are clearly rocks from the top of the canyon, and that in all of the many years that he's been a tour guide along this river, that he's never seen one of those things fall. And so just the time scale that it must have taken for all of those individual rocks to fall is kind of the basis for how he begins to approach and understand the enormity of deep geological time. And I thought that was kind of a very interesting, non-academic way that people could engage with such the staggering concept of geological time. And
that sounds like a really awesome conceptualization.
It really is. There's a lot about that book that I really enjoy. It has some interesting musings on kind of the interplay and competition between academia and religion. One thing I will say I don't particularly like about the book is I feel that the romance that is present in the book does not add very much.
That's common.
Yeah.
It's a common one.
That it is the least interesting part of a book that is otherwise very, very interesting. I will also say that the book is very long. It's like 500, 600 pages, but it's very much worth your time.
Okay.
It's like once you get about halfway in, you just start flying through it because you really want to see what happens next. Oh, I have one more question about your time in Tanzania real quick.
Absolutely.
So I've kind of heard different people say the country's name in different ways. I've most heard Tanzania, but I've also heard some people say Tanzania. And I'm wondering what your perspective on that is.
The latter is a no. I don't think there's any context in which that strong A for the name is right in the second A. When I'm speaking English, I say Tanzania because it's the typical English pronunciation of the word. When I'm speaking Swahili, I would say Tanzania. The emphasis goes onto the second syllable, and the A's are soft rather than hard. So I'd say those are your two options. But when speaking English, I say Tanzania.
Cool.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, and thanks for joining us today, Dana.
Oh, absolutely. I'm glad to be here.
Tell me, Dana, is there anything beautiful in the way that a rusted out car in the middle of a snowy field is? And if so, what?
I would say that it is in fact beautiful, and it's an example of the briefness of life. It reminds us to hold tight onto what we have.
Yes, but that there's also beauty in bleakness.
There's beauty in bleakness. I've been thinking for a while, actually, that it would be a really cool architectural project for somebody to build a sound structure inside the void space of those collapsing barns.
That would be kind of neat. It's funny that you mentioned that. That's one thing that a lot of farmers are doing to kind of make some money on the side, is they're selling wood from like doors and panels of old barns to like modern day brew pubs to use as their
I've heard that.
tables.
I've heard that. You can get somebody to pay you to come take down your old structure.
Yeah. What a brilliant scam. Hello, and thank you for listening so far into this episode. Over the past couple of episodes, you guys may remember that I've talked a little bit about museums and other institutions that you can use your support. And I'm going to do that again today, but this time I'm going to ask you to help me, help us, help museums. And what I'd like you to do is I've learned recently that up to a third of American museums may not survive closures and other economic effects imposed by the COVID-19 pandemic. And what I'd like to do is to try to compile information about what museums have needs and how they are requesting assistance meeting those needs, whether it be by soliciting memberships, soliciting donations, assistance with conserving collections, willingness to take on other institutions' collections. If you have knowledge of a museum or other preservational institution that has need, please share them in the comment section or reach out to me otherwise that I may continue to compile them and share this information with the researchers that I work with and the public that I can communicate with. Obviously, I have a great love and appreciation of museums, and I think that if you've listened to any number of episodes of this podcast, you probably like museums too and would like to see the place of museums in our society and in our science continue. And there are things that we can do both as scientists and member of the public to help protect these institutions. And I can use your help to make sure that we can do everything that we can to help these beloved institutions. Thank you.